Hey guys, I thought what I would do is I would kind of talk through this piece on plans, productions, and perceptions, sort of to go along with the written piece. I know maybe some people prefer to listen, or maybe be a little further explanation as well. So this is to go along with the piece that is above. Um, and what I'm sort of getting into is this idea of planning, game plans, blueprints, models. I'm using those all somewhat interchangeably to reference a mode of thinking that's very prevalent. This mode of thinking has to do with something coming before an action that determines the action. And this whole piece is very heavily inspired by Tim Ingold in Being Alive essays on perception, right? In the prologue, he has a section in there on production. And he's talking about this idea, Marx and Engels are trying to figure out production and consumption. And they reach this conclusion that says, well, what separates humans is that we plan things, right? Maybe the beaver chops down a tree and it makes a dam, but that's different than if I want to build a house, I draw out a blueprint, right? So this house exists before it's built. And the house really can be judged on the level to which it conforms to the blueprint which is drawn, right? So a good house is one that realizes the plan that came before it. So Ingold gets into this, right? But it's pretty clear to see how this kind of thinking pervades a lot of our life, right? And Susan Oyama, has a very, very similar argument in regards to genetics and blueprints, right? So as it applies to sport, it's this idea of game plans, models, systems. I'm using these again interchangeably. I know some people might say, well, this is the difference between a game plan and a game system. But I'm using these all just to refer to some type of a plan, right, that comes before. So it's a little bit broader of a category, right? And there's a couple issues that I'm sort of raising with this. And the first one is just sort of logical if you sort of do this chicken and egg thing and you trace it back. And, we have these various stories and folklore about where the game comes from, someone kicking around a coconut. But it seems very unlikely that there was somebody before the first ball was ever kicked who was like, okay, this is the formation that we're going to play and this is the system, It seems pretty obvious, I would put forth, that something like a game plan is based on a previous game, right? It can't really come before. So if we accept that, which I think it's difficult not to, then the causal power starts to diminish, where the idea that this plan is something that exists before the game and then causes the action which comes later starts to a little bit weaken. But there's another angle that I sort of take up that I think unravels it even further. And that is to do with this idea of levels of organization, sort of hierarchy of movement. And this also very corresponds very closely to what's usually thought of as the technical-tactical distinction. And I disagree deeply with the assumptions of this sort of a hierarchy of apparent complexity or cognitive complexity of actions, but I'm taking it up, I'm adopting it for this piece just to sort of show from within its own language the weaknesses of the system, right? So there's this general idea that some actions are sort of raw building blocks, right? So the ability to play a 10-yard pass inside of your foot is sort of a fundamental technical foundation that, later something of a advanced technical plan is built on, right? And that's not really a crazy way to think, right? Because if the coach says, switch the ball, they're not going to say, stand on your left leg, swing your right leg like a pendulum so that it contacts the ball at its midpoint, thus creating a certain trajectory and arc. This would be absurd, right? And even at that level, there's infinitely more things that need to be specified. So we come to this realization that the plan is never a one-to-one correlation with what ends up happening in reality. The plan is something that needs to be filled in. It is sort of maybe an outline, but what animates it or what fills it in is something of a different level, right? According to this type of thinking. So there's something that's still the responsibility of the players, which is to carry out these raw movements, right? And that's what we usually would call technical ability, right? And this is what is thought of as being the level that the player is responsible for. So I use this example of the video game FIFA, right, which is a popular game. And if you've ever played, you know that there's things that you control, right? So you can tell the player to move left and right using the joystick. You can tell them to play a pass. But beneath, to use this framework, a certain level, you don't control the movement. You don't have to tell them to put one foot in front of the other, to swing their leg at the ball. Those things are taken care of by the AI. You are kind of a little bit above, right, this level, where you're working at sort of maybe this intermediate level. Because then above that, of course, we have the AI. You can set your tactics to be attacking, defensive, or whatever. But you're responsible for this middle layer. So I use this sort of as an example also that is taken up in the way that the instruction relates to the action. So the coach says, we're going to switch it to the weak side winger, who is going to get to the end line and cut the ball back. This is something, of course, that's animated or filled in, right, by the movements of the players that they are responsible for at the technical level, right? So they have to physically do these things. But there's another issue here, and that is it's pretty well understood that this heuristic or this plan is not something that applies across all scenarios. So, you could come up with all these different caveats, right? And young kids are very good at this. They love to do this. Mom says, clean your room. Kid says, well, what if the house is burning down? What if it's the end of the world? Do I still need to clean my room, right? So the analog sort of in sport would be to say, well, what if you're on the goal line? What if the keeper is out of position and you have a tap in? Do you still want me to play the winger? Who's then gonna, and that's obviously a step backwards. So no coach in the world expects the player to forego the open goal. That's just sort of a given, right? And I use that as sort of an obvious example, but there's so many more. If the other winger happens to be lying down on the pitch because he's just been injured the last play, we're obviously not going to switch it to him then. But we could come up with infinite amount of these things where it's very obvious to the players on the field that this heuristic does not apply in this situation. So the question is, well, with what ability are they determining the conditions of application for the heuristic, or the boundary condition? And I think there's a sort of a subtle wink to Gödel's incompleteness here, and idea of jurisdiction of mathematical systems. But the idea that you can't, from within the heuristic, say when it applies. So if we want to play a certain system, or that is maybe a more specific play that is not maybe an all-encompassing system like a formation or something, but at any of these levels, there's some point at which the player has to determine, is this something that right now applies? Because it's not something that's specified in the plan itself. So even using this hierarchical framework, we have to acknowledge that this is a level above the heuristic, sort of a meta-heuristic of, well, when does this framework apply? So at this level, it also uses the player's skillful coping, right? And I think this probably dovetails very well with Riedfeld's skilled intentionality framework, right? And I sort of use this example of in the recent Euros when Christian Eriksen collapses on the pitch, and you see the way that the players respond. They respond skillfully, and they recognize the layers of coping that are going on here, right? At one level, they're playing a game. They had been given, say, a game plan from the coach, but they understand very clearly in this moment the game stops, and nobody's saying, "Well, coach, can I stop playing now? Do I still need to be a left back in this system?" No, they're no longer left back. They're no longer playing whatever formation. They all of a sudden attend to the needs of the situation. So their own perceptual abilities clearly told them, because this isn't specified. I mean, I highly doubt the coach said, if a player collapses from heart attack, it's okay for you to stop using the game plan, right? This is something that they understood this with their own perceptual abilities. So both levels, using this hierarchical framework, both levels below and above the tactical part of the game, the players' immediate real-time action perception capabilities are required. So the question then remaining is, well, why is it that in this sort of an intermediate level of tactics, is it thought that it could only be done by direct instruction from the coach, something verbal or visual in the sense of like a whiteboard, or one of those little magnet boards, or something with X's and O's and arrows and stuff, right? And why is it that at this level it's still kind of this boogeyman where it's too complex for constraints? How could we constrain something that would allow a third man run to emerge? That seems very overwhelming, seems almost impossible. And it's not that hard to say, listen, this guy's got to go here, this girl needs to make this run there, and yada yada, right? It's a lot easier to do by an instruction. So the question is, why do we feel this way? And I try to put my finger on a certain type of path dependency that, shout out to Mark O'Sullivan and James Vaughan, have done a lot of work to bring to light in development. And that, I would say, also calls on the same thinking, this type of path dependency. And the path dependency has this assumption that players are being produced, right? This is a word that has been understood to be problematic in some circles now. Players are being produced for the professional game. So the professional game is something that pre-exists. We've got a U8 player coming in, and if all goes well, they will, move through these levels of the game, and eventually they may make a first team debut. And this would be sort of the idea of the pro club, the pro level being the consumer that is placing an order on the academy or various academies to produce, right? To produce players that fit a certain standard. And again, we go back to the same example that we had with the coach and the game plan, where I said, well, where, if we trace it back, did this exist before, right? Clearly, the professional level has to emerge out of the game rather than the game being funneled into the professional level. That's, I think, quite apparent. But the problem is this. The professional level, people always will show these clips of, oh, we'll look at Pep, he's using mannequins, and it's a passing pattern, shadow play, there's no defenders, so, if he does it, then it must mean that level, it's only the only thing you can do. And the question sort of that I'm raising is, well, how do we know that this is beyond the ability of players? So, of course, for people who are familiar with, motor learning, skill acquisition, and particularly the concept of smart perceptual systems, the idea of any of these movements or actions being sort of like raw building blocks, it's very absurd, to think that playing something like a 10-yard pass is simple, and making this third man run is complex, right? We're not very good at judging complexity because our perceptual systems are already using higher order information variables, right? So we start already from higher order. So we don't need to posit which ones are complex and which ones are simple, because they all are already complex, in the sense that the amount of things that your body and the environment is organizing with regard to is always very high, even in something that appears simple, like just a 10-yard pass inside of the foot. But there's this layer that sort of is between what is usually called technical and tactical. So I use first touch as an example here. And you hear this talked about a lot when there's a player, I'll say like Zidane, right? Zidane had this kind of a silky first touch. And, if we think about it in this separated way of like, well, there's some physical ability to intercept the ball. The ball's moving and you've got to get your body in the way of it and stop it. But then there's a different level at which the player has to do tactical things, and they have to decide, now that I've controlled the ball, am I going to drop it to the 6? Am I going to try to take a forward touch and beat this player? All these things, right? So the idea that these are two different layers. But if you look at any of the good players, it's very clear that these things are not separated, right? And this is where we get this gap that's difficult to explain, where it's a sort of instinctive good first touch from this player. They have a natural knack for the game. They look fluid, right? And this is at a level of things that are not even usually considered to be tactical, right? They are more local level things, like controlling the ball. But there's something in them that's still recognized to be more than just a pure physical raw movement. And when we look at this range of things, we either get an explanation that's sort of a woo-woo natural talent, instinct, something kind of like that. But there's one other point where there's this mythology of street soccer, right? And that comes into popular discourse a lot, where this player, they have that sort of a knack because street soccer, and they grew up in the favelas in Brazil, and they were kicking around a ball of rags, and that somehow counts for it, right? And to be honest, I find this not very convincing directly as an explanation, right? There's nothing probably magical about playing with a ball of rags or an asphalt surface or something like this. But what it does is it fills in this place that's sort of left blank in the technical tactical explanation that really is much more elegantly explained by constraints and skills as adaptations, right? And it's this idea that the environment can also be rich with information, and that it's something that appears to be simple, like a 10-yard pass, actually has many layers of nuance to it. So the fact that we try to separate these things in development, where developmental coaching is giving players a technical foundation that can then later be used in tactical planning, that starts to show us maybe why this sort of a path dependency continues, right? Because if the players train in an environment that assumes the skill to be something that is not a decision, it's only just a physical thing, and it has to be supplemented by a mental thing, well then they also have sort of impoverished environment to be able to learn how to make these higher order decisions, right, that we think of as tactical. And again, if we understand what's going on, it's to make this hierarchy is very sort of arbitrary. But since this is going to be something that most people are going to assume, I'm sort of using it for this purpose, right? So I take the metaphor of if you wanted to bake bread and you go to the store and you can't find whole wheat flour. All you see is like white bleached flour. But you want to make whole wheat bread, so you go to the health food aisle and you get like wheat germ, wheat bran, and you mix them in together and you make what you wanted to make, which was whole wheat bread. And maybe because the store didn't carry whole wheat flour, this was something that was easier. And you say, well, how am I going to get whole wheat out of white flour? But what we're forgetting here is that white flour is not natural, right? White flour is something that requires a process to remove the things which we're later adding back in. And I think, for me, this captures very well what goes on in development. We create an artificially impoverished situation. And note, it's important to note here that it can never be entirely impoverished, right? So this ideal of the contextless skill doesn't exist. So, and even actually, I think this is side note, but when people say, oh, well, look at this decontextualized training, it's a little bit sometimes ironic in that we're starting from a position that there is no such thing as a decontextualized skill. So there isn't really such thing as decontextualized training, but we do understand that there can be different types of information present or not present in the environment, right? So anyways, back to the point. If we understand that players are developing in an environment which assumes these things to be separated, then later it makes sense that they would expect a coach to give them this sort of higher level instruction at the tactical level. But we don't really know what would happen if an entire generation of players developed without these things having been separated, right? Without the wheat germ and the wheat bran being stripped out of the wheat, right? We could put them back together later, and that's sort of what we see in the professional game. But because constraints-led approach is quite new, we don't know really what would happen with a whole generation of players who grew up with these things being, put into the environment, and put in is not the right word, right? If they're being constrained in a way that allows them to emerge, right? There's no reason to think that players couldn't perceive directly these quote-unquote tactical aspects of the game at any level of apparent complexity, which I tend to think there's a lot of Emperor's stuff going on here with it, knowing the game, and this guy's got a high football IQ, and I think a lot of it's sort of shrouded in mystery for a reason. But I don't see any reason that constraints-led approach can't I'm not going to say the P word, but can't allow players to develop that are capable of perceiving directly these elements of the game. And I liken this a lot to the idea of there was a point in history when it was thought that maybe only scribes and scholars could read or were capable of literacy. But this seemed to be true. The very reason why it seemed to be true was because regular people weren't allowed to read. They were not given access to books. So, to sum things up, I think that the jury may still be out in some sense because we're at a very early point in this story. But to me, all the early signs, all the analysis of how learning and skill acquisition works would point to this being a much more globally optimal situation, as opposed to the game sort of stuck in a certain rut that is what I would call a local optima. It might be easier, the way it might be easier to buy white flour and wheat bran and put them together. But does that mean that that is an optimal solution as compared to just leaving them together in the first place? And that's where I would say no. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I may end up doing some more recordings like this in addition to writing in the future. So if you like it, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.